All right, so we're going to talk about petroleum or oil. It is connected to natural gas, so there are slides after about natural gas, but I'm going to talk about that in a separate video. So, oil, aka crude oil or petroleum, two different terms for the same stuff. We're talking about underground, a very viscous, thick substance that has a whole bunch of hydrocarbons. Remember, hydrocarbons are carbons with hydrogen attached, and you can get chains of these, and they can be branching. All these nodes are inferred to be carbon. You can also have rings, lots of different types. So we have a mixture of different length change, different shapes of hydrocarbons, and underground they're completely mixed. And so when we extract this substance, the crude part implies the fact that it is a mixture and it's not neatly separated into different parts. We'll talk about that separation. So it's somewhat easy to get the first maybe half of a deposit of oil or petroleum from the ground. Getting more of it up out of the ground is harder and takes more energy, so that only starts to happen as the price of the value of the oil rises. And because you have to exert energy into the extraction, we're going to have a lowering of the net energy yield. Doesn't mean that the stuff that's coming out of the ground has less energy, it's just the inputs versus outputs. So let's look at how petroleum forms. This is a similar process to coal, except you're starting with different organisms. In the case of petroleum, the starting organisms are plankton. So this has to be in an environment that is completely submerged. So a lot of what are now land masses used to be covered by seas. And as the plankton died and settled to the bottom, not all of them were decomposed, and as they could have been mixed in the sediments, much lower oxygen levels, and therefore less decomposition happening. And as time passed and more pressure accumulated, the hydrocarbons and lipids from those plankton formed this substance called oil. Some of those hydrocarbons are larger and longer and thicker, and we end up with oil. Some of them are very small and volatile. They're gaseous form, and so you often have both natural gas and oil in the same regions. So when we get a source of crude oil, we do something called refining. Refineries or refining is when you separate the crude oil into all of its different components. And you do that by heating it up very slowly. At lower temperatures, you'll have substances that are already gases. So methane, butane, propane, those are all gases at standard temperature and pressure. And so those will come off very easily. As you start to warm up that crude oil to a slightly higher temperature, gasoline will vaporize, and you can distill that or collect that. And as we continue to raise the temperature, we get different sets of hydrocarbons that become gaseous or become separated from the hydrocarbon soup, as it were. So aviation fuel is different from gasoline. Heating oil is another major component of that. That's a much thicker, more viscous hydrocarbon that we use to warm our homes. Diesel, and then we start to get the substances that are much lower ability to aerosolize, become gases. And so that's where you would get something like petroleum jelly, right? That literally is a component of crude oil. And asphalt is sort of the mixture of tar-like substances that is left at the end. So one of the acronyms you should be familiar with when it comes to petroleum is OPEC. This is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which means it is a cartel, meaning a group of businesses that get together to influence how and where and why a substance is sold and different prices. And so right now, OPEC consists of these 14 countries. There are countries that were members, like Indonesia and Qatar were members, but left. And there are countries that produce a lot of oil, such as Russia, the US, China, and Canada, that aren't part of OPEC. And so if we scroll down, you can see this is a nice map because it distinguishes between countries that are OPEC members, these blue ones. I tried to cover up Indonesia and Qatar with brown because they are not an OPEC member. In the North Sea, we've got the UK and Norway. We've got the US, Canada, and then other countries that produce oil to greater or lesser degrees, but aren't part of OPEC. And so if we look at where we have oil, I wanted to point out that these are the reserves. And these particular reserves are the ones that are proven, meaning we've tested and we know there is oil there, as opposed to ones that geologically we believe there to be oil there. So Canada, huge quantities of oil, mostly in the form of oil sands and oil shale, which we'll talk about at the end of this. Russia's got quite a bit. Here's Qatar, which has quite a bit in the Middle East, but then you zoom in on the other Middle Eastern countries and you can see why they formed the OPEC in the first place. Huge, huge volumes of oil that they want to be able to influence how much is being distributed and the prices and all that jazz. So, thinking about oil in terms of its pros and cons, obviously we have quite a bit of it. We use it for a lot of different sources, as you saw in the refining diagram. We do have quite a bit of energy that comes out compared to the amount of energy that goes in, and it's easy to move it around. We've got a huge amount of infrastructure that's already out there. And the other thing to be aware of is that we use this for a lot of non-energy sources. Petrochemicals are found in cosmetics, agriculture, plastics, huge, huge demand for it. However, the demand and the inefficiency of the usage comes because we have some pretty artificially low prices. We're not being careful about influencing how much is out there, and efficiency. Obviously, there's a lot of carbon dioxide that is released, and because it has some of the same kinds of pollutants in it, the sulfur and nitrogen compounds. When you combust oil, you also get sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides forming, and there's a lot of water pollution associated with it because of our transportation and extraction methods. So let's talk a little bit about that as we look at the case study that is oil sands and oil shale. So if we think back to the fact that oil is formed as dead plankton accumulated at the sea floor, there's also sediments down there. And so you don't always get just like lakes of oil. You often find oil that is embedded in rock or sand substances. And so we call that oil sands, sometimes referred to as tar sands, and oil shale. That's a sedimentary rock type. So initially, nobody paid any attention to these because it wasn't very easy to extract the oil from that. But as price of oil increases, it becomes more lucrative to get the oil out of a rock. How do we do that? Well, we have to mine for it, and then we have to do something to make the oil less viscous and able to flow out. Usually there's a lot of heat and or hot water that is used to basically warm up the oil and allow it to seep out. That has a lot of downsides to it. We're talking about very large regions If you can see this, there's a vehicle. So that's the scale that we're looking at right here. The problem with this stuff is that you basically are taking all of the negatives of coal and all of the negatives of oil to get this substance. And while it's still using the same infrastructure as oil, and therefore it's not super expensive to build new infrastructure, it's incredibly resource intensive. And so you have to extract huge amounts of the oil sands to get the oil that we want. We're talking about a lot of water that is being used to extract the oil, and therefore a lot of water pollution that results from this. And so if you're familiar with the Keystone XL pipeline that people have been talking about in the news, that is an example of a pipeline that was built to connect Canadian oil sands regions to distribution and refining centers in Texas. And so all of the habitat destruction for new pipeline, but also what happens when we spill oil, that is all associated with that particular pipeline. Other major oil spills include the Exxon Valdez, which was a tanker that spilled oil off the coast of Alaska. And then the Deepwater Horizon was an oil well that started releasing materials into the water in the Gulf of Mexico. However, the amount of oil and gasoline that's being spilled on an everyday basis, whether we're talking about from oil sands or we're talking about just regular using the oil, transporting it, bringing it up out of the ground, there's just a lot of pollution. And because it is more, it's less dense, it's not a solid, it spreads out. And so it's a bigger problem in terms of land and water contamination than coal was.